How's everyone doing today? Well, what we're going to do now is discuss my top 10 reasons why one should learn Akkadian. You may have a different list. You may completely agree. You may rank these in different order. So I'm going to count backwards. Number 10, Akkadian survived time. If you think about it, Akkadian is one of the oldest languages recorded. It's not the oldest, but it's right near there. And it's the fact that we were able to dig it up and decode it and understand it and see how it compares to other living languages is beyond impressive. So there may be other languages that we don't know about that wrote on materials that just didn't survive because the materials they may be organic materials. They may have a very short shelf life. Think about how we write in sand or on an Etch-a-Sketch or something like that. And maybe those things weren't fully developed writing systems. I mean, even when we look at the antecedents of Akkadian, especially in Sumerian and Proto-Sumerian, things that, look more pictographic than logographic, right? We can see that, well, Akkadian's right there toward the start of language development, but it was on clay tablets, and these tablets have survived time. So we have to give the language credit for that. And moreover, certain dialects of Neo-Aramaic actually maintain a lot of Akkadian. So we could argue that in some capacity, the Akkadian language still exists today. Number 9, Akkadian is the oldest recorded Semitic language, especially if you want to consider things like Amorite too, or personal names, right? Like, now we get into the debate about what's actually Akkadian. Well, look, it's this, we're going to categorize it as East Semitic in its tradition and trajectory. And what it does is it gives us a foundation for the way in which the later Semitic languages that we encounter in the textual record develop. So it's especially important when we look at things like the development of Hebrew, for example, or Aramaic and things like that, because you see forms in Akkadian that maybe they'll persist in Arabic, maybe they'll persist in Aramaic, maybe they'll persist in Hebrew, but at some point in time, divergence starts happening. And looking at it, the older it gets, the more interesting it is and what it can tell us about language and language change. Akkadian can also pose a gateway to learning more about archaeology, right? And so sometimes people, they'll be in both fields. They'll be, digging the things up and then they'll read them. Like you look at an archaeologist on TV or a fictional character, right? They're cross-trained in everything. I've had courses in archaeology, but I'm not an archaeologist, right? An archaeologist is someone who spends their time with the materials themselves. Maybe they have language training. Maybe they are trained in both, but most of the time, Akkadian can be one of those things that makes people interested in material culture because archaeologists are going to touch pots more than they're going to touch language for the most part. They're going to look at the ruins of cities. They're going to look at foundations and, little aspects of daily life. And they can start to read a site, but maybe Akkadian's one of the things that kind of introduces us to that life too, because it's not enough just to know the text, but to know, well, where was the text found? In what context? How did it get there? And what can that strata or the layer and how far down it is tell us the story about the text itself? Think about the Code of Hammurabi, for instance. We actually found it at the Elamite site in Susa. This is in Iran and Khuzestan. So, how did it get there, right? Like that's its own story. And so Akkadian and learning about the actual text that we have can introduce us to the story of the text too. And that story sometimes is just as important as what we read in the text. Number 7, look, Akkadian looks cool. It's triangles in clay, right? But how cool is that? It looks like a code. It's not just foreign looking. I mean, it looks out of this world. It's, we don't write like that at all. We use strokes, right? Like there's some type of leakage, like ink, and that is going to reside on a surface of some type. This isn't. This is an impression in clay. It's almost like, the perforated, printing devices we used to have, right? Like, what is that? Some kind of code. But this looks a lot cooler. And, if you just look at the way it's written in its stylistic forms too, each of those tell a story that then gets coded into some kind of triangular wedge. We can make as many fun fonts of the Latin alphabet as we want, but Akkadian looks pretty cool. Number 6, Akkadian preserves the most ancient records of administering a civilization. You may think it's fun to read about all the gods and goddesses, the mythology, the ancient sciences, and things like that. But look, a lot of Akkadian is receipts and letters, things that contracts, even, right? Like, how does a society operate? And so there are certain things that never change. They haven't changed in 5,000 years, and other things that maybe are a little different, and they show some kind of movement, whether it's progress or regress. You be the judge of all that. But we take it for granted sometimes that the vast amount of literature we have is actually bureaucratic, or it's personal letters too, right? You get to see how not just a king or the royal court would correspond with other royals. We have a lot of that, but you get to see personal things too, and that's neat. Number 5, Akkadian was the first lingua franca in the world. In other words, it was the first language that everybody used for correspondence. And so if you look at places like, the Hittite Empire, or even at Ugarit in Syria, there's large Akkadian deposits there. Well, what about Egypt? The Amarna letters. These are all Akkadian documents. And so we know Akkadian is being used for international correspondence. And that's pretty important because it's showing that there's a culture of communication, and that culture is related to scribal tradition, and that somehow, in some way, it made sense to station people, or at least to teach people and bring them back, to serve their empire or kingdom or whatever, in a common form of communication. And that's the first time we see it in the world, and that's pretty impressive. Number 4, most ancient epics in human civilization are recorded in Akkadian. That might be debatable. I mean, because I don't know, number 1, I'm not defining ancient. We can look at something a couple thousand years after Akkadian. Actually, Akkadian's written into the Common Era too, so it's when is ancient, right? Like the pyramids were ancient for the Romans. Okay, so that's a long time ago. And maybe some Egyptians, would, argue to the contrary. But if you look at the amount of epic literature that we find in Akkadian, we've translated a lot to English, and some things are very popular, things like Gilgamesh, Enuma Elish, things of this nature, Atrahasis epic even. There's just so much out there that is worth reading and preserving, that belongs alongside the Greco-Roman myths that we grew up with, or Norse or Celtic myths that we read, even myths from the Far East. I mean, all of these are they're all valuable and worth reading. And I think that what's cool about Akkadian stuff is just the age of it, and sometimes we can see how these epics might influence other epics of neighboring or maybe even distant cultures. Number 3, Akkadian preserves some of the world's most ancient scientific literature. So what's cool about this is that we could call it proto-science, but it's science nonetheless, right? It's science maybe without a defined scientific method, but the things like mathematics, astronomy, medicine, right? All of these, pharmacology, like we have records that go back into the far ancient world, and buildings had to get built somehow. Monumental architecture had to happen somehow, right? People had to know about growing times and seasons. They needed to know how to heal one another. And what's really fascinating for me about the science of this era is that people are discovering things without the tools that we have today. We have so many tools and we have resources for communication. This was more isolated, and it would probably relied upon a lot of know-how, generational know-how, trial and error, and then finding a way to encode that and teach it over time. So if you're into science, Akkadian sciences are, they're right up there with the best that there is. Number two, you get to learn about the world of the Bible. A lot of people who study Akkadian, they actually enter Akkadian through uh, the study of Hebrew or Aramaic, or they're doing some kind of biblical studies. And Akkadian is important because it tells what's going on in the world in which Scripture emerged. And so the study of Akkadian may fill in the blanks, right? If some features of scripture talk about, when a community is mobile or they lived in a certain house or a tent or something like this, or they dealt with a foreign force coming in, well, what was it like, right? Akkadian often fills in the blanks and colors the culture, the society, what life was like in the ancient world. And so that then becomes a lens through which people can study scripture. Number one, and this is my number one, Akkadians Hard. In fact, I had a colleague, he's now a colleague, he was a professor at the time. I was talking about how some of the students in class when we were first taking Akkadian were struggling with it. And his response was, hey, Akkadian's hard, right? Like almost telling us to cut yourself some slack. It's a hard language, but it's not as though you can't do it. It's very doable. But it's one of the harder languages. I'd call it a category 4, not quite a category 5, because we don't speak it, right? We don't have to worry about too many sounds that are difficult to articulate, like Arabic or something like that. Even though it may have had some, we don't necessarily know the full phonological range of Akkadian because it's recorded in Sumerian characters and Sumerian writing. So we're sort of bound to that system. So it's not the hardest, but it's maybe like learning Japanese a little bit. So you have to learn logograms, you have to learn syllabic characters, and it's work. And once you do it, you feel pretty accomplished. Now take this top 10 list in aggregate, put it all together. What's the real reason for learning Akkadian? You know. Aliens.